Some movies are bad, but then there are movies so painful, so mind-bogglingly awful. They make you question everything. Roger Ebert didn't just dislike these films, he torched them with words so sharp, they cut deeper than the movies themselves. Let's dive into the 10 worst films he ever reviewed. Buckle up. A movie is truly bad when even a star-studded cast can't save it. When the dialogue feels like a parody of itself. When every moment drags you deeper into confusion rather than intrigue. Mad Dog Time, 1996, is that kind of movie. Roger Ebert didn't just dislike it. He called it the first movie I have seen that does not improve on the sight of a blank screen viewed for the same length of time. That's a special kind of failure. The setup should work. A mob boss named Vic, Richard Dreyfuss, checks out of a mental institution, only to find his criminal empire on the brink of collapse. His right-hand man Mickey, Jeff Goldblum, has been holding things together, or trying to, while an endless parade of gangsters line up to take their shot at the throne. The problem? Nothing moves with urgency, or even interest. Conversations feel like someone wrote a Tarantino script in wet cement, stylized but sluggish. Scenes drift with no real tension, no sense of stakes, no reason to care about anyone in the room. And with a cast including Gabriel Byrne, Diane Lane, Burt Reynolds, Ellen Barkin, and Michael J. Pollard, that's saying something. Maybe the biggest offense is that it wants to be cool. The suits, the guns, the jazz lounge aesthetic, it's all there. But the movie? It just sits there, a collection of scenes with no real pulse. When a film makes a critic long for a blank screen, that says it all. A comedy only works when it has a point of view, a sharp edge, a real perspective. Rude Awakening, 1989, doesn't just lack those things. It fumbles every opportunity to find them. Roger Ebert didn't just dislike this movie, he gave it 0 stars, calling it an insult to whatever beliefs it dimly thinks it upholds. The premise could have worked. Cheech Marin and Eric Roberts play two hippies who escaped to the Central American jungle in the 1960s to avoid the Vietnam War draft. They return 20 years later with top-secret government plans and expect to rally the movement. But instead, they find a New York City that's become everything they once opposed. That setup should lead to something insightful, maybe even biting satire about how the counterculture sold out or how the world moved on without them. Instead, the film meanders through one awkward, forced joke after another. The hippies are caricatures, not characters. The yuppies are punchlines, not people. The humor? Ebert called it excruciatingly bad, and he wasn't wrong. The movie leans on outdated slapstick, but it never commits to anything, neither full-on absurdity nor any kind of real critique. Every joke falls flat because there's no real tension, no real stakes. By the time the film reaches for a message, it's already lost whatever it was trying to say. A movie about abandoned ideals shouldn't feel this empty. But Rude Awakening never decides what it wants to be, so it becomes nothing at all. Last Rites wasn't just panned, it was torn apart. Roger Ebert didn't just dislike it, he called it the worst movie of 1988. A thriller that lacks tension, a drama that fumbles emotion. This isn't just a misfire, it's a collision of bad decisions. Tom Berenger plays Father Michael Pace, a priest caught in a tangled web of secrets, betrayal, and a forbidden affair. But what should be gripping turns into a slow, meandering slog. The film wants to explore morality, guilt, and desire, but instead it wanders, tripping over its own melodrama. Ebert's biggest issue? The exploitation of religious themes, thrown into a plot so unbelievable that even the performances can't ground it. It is not only bad filmmaking, he wrote, but it is offensive to my intelligence. That's not just a bad review, it's a warning. Every plot twist, contrived, every emotional beat, forced. The film thinks it's saying something profound, but Ebert argued that it was nothing more than a feverish scavenger hunt through pulp thriller cliches. By the time the credits roll, you're not left with questions, just regret. Last Rites promised intensity and drama. What it delivers is a film that fails, not just as a thriller, but as a story worth telling. Some movies sink. This one drowns. Jaws: The Revenge isn't just a bad sequel, it's a bewildering one. The fourth film in a franchise that once defined the summer blockbuster, now reduced to a shark with a personal vendetta, literally. Roger Ebert didn't just dislike it, he gave it 0 stars, calling it not simply a bad movie, but also a stupid and incompetent one. This time, Ellen Brody, widow of the late Chief Brody, believes a great white is hunting her family, not just showing up in the same area, but actively tracking her from Amity Island to the Bahamas. The ocean's vast. The logic here? Not so much. The suspense? Gone. The shark? Somehow worse looking than in 1975. The final act? Bizarre. Ebert called it an incompetent climax, and he wasn't alone. The dream within a dream sequences, the low-budget animatronics, the telepathic connection between Ellen and the shark, it all plays out like an extended hallucination. Jaws: The Revenge isn't just a case of a franchise running on empty, it's a case of crashing and sinking. The original gave us terror in the deep. This one, just deep regret. Some comedies miss the mark. Sour Grapes doesn't just miss, it trips over it, falls, and stays there. Larry David, co-creator of Seinfeld, master of cringe humor, crafted a film that left 0 laughs and 0 stars in Roger Ebert's review. A story about a petty argument over a casino jackpot should have been sharp, cynical, maybe even brilliant. Instead, Ebert called it tone-deaf and cringe-inducing, but not in the way Larry David intended. The setup? Simple. One guy lends another a couple of quarters at a slot machine, and somehow that snowballs into absolute chaos. The problem? It's not funny chaos. It's exhausting. Characters aren't just unlikable, they're grating. The humor isn't just dark, it's baffling. Ebert compared it to Crash, not the Oscar-winning one, but the erotic thriller about car accident fetishists. That was a movie about things no one finds sexy. Sour Grapes? A comedy about things no one finds funny. Cancer, castration, racial stereotypes, bitter family feuds. It's all in there. And none of it lands. Larry David would more than recover with Curb Your Enthusiasm. But this was a false start. Some movies shock, others disturb. But I Spit on Your Grave? Roger Ebert called it one of the most depressing experiences of his career. This wasn't just a bad film to him. It was dangerous. A movie so cruel, so artless, that he walked out of the theater not just disgusted, but ashamed that it even existed. The story is simple, brutal, relentless. A woman is attacked, she survives, she seeks revenge. But for Ebert, the issue wasn't just what happened on screen, it was how the audience reacted to it. This movie is an expression of the most diseased and perverted darker human natures. There is no reason to see this movie except to be entertained by the sight of sadism and suffering. That reaction? Chilling. He didn't just hate I Spit on Your Grave, he hated that people were cheering for it. The film's defenders call it a raw, uncompromising revenge thriller. Ebert saw exploitation, not empowerment. Even decades later, this movie remains a test, not of endurance, but of what people take from it. Does it expose something raw and real, or just sink into the muck? Ebert made his stance clear. He walked out of the theater feeling unclean. The question is, will you? Have you ever watched a movie so bad, so mind-bogglingly awful, that you just had to tell someone about it? Yeah, same. If you love deep dives into the forgotten, the bizarre, and the painfully bad, then hit subscribe to Vintage Verse. We cover the best, the worst, and everything in between. Some bad movies fade. Others linger. North? Roger Ebert hated it. Not just in passing, he went out of his way to make sure everyone knew just how much. Elijah Wood plays a kid who decides his parents aren't good enough. So naturally, he takes them to court. The ruling? He gets to travel the world auditioning replacements. What follows is a parade of stereotypes, a script that thinks it's clever, and a tone that bounces between whimsical and deeply unsettling. Ebert's reaction? Pure frustration. North is a bad film, one of the worst movies ever made. This wasn't just a forgettable misfire. It was a failure on every level. A story with zero emotional weight, a comedy that wasn't funny, a message so warped that he worried about what kids would take from it. And he didn't just dislike it, he couldn't stand it. His legendary review dropped the word hate 10 times in a single paragraph. The strangest part? This wasn't made by a hack. Rob Reiner directed When Harry Met Sally, Misery, This is Spinal Tap. And yet, North happened. Ebert called it a lapse in judgment, a movie he hoped Reiner would recover from sooner than he would. Roger Ebert didn't just dislike Deuce Bigalow European Gigolo, he went out of his way to bury it. And in doing so, he started a fight. The movie itself? Rob Schneider is back, this time in Amsterdam, because apparently one film about a male prostitute wasn't enough. But instead of just leaning into the absurdity, it drowns in lazy jokes, tired stereotypes, and a plot thinner than a postcard. Ebert didn't just give it 0 stars, he used his review to fire back at Schneider himself. After another critic called Deuce Bigalow bad, Schneider mocked him for never winning a Pulitzer. Ebert's response? As chance would have it, I have. His review wasn't just a takedown of the film, it was a masterclass in how to dismantle bad comedy. Deuce Bigalow is aggressively bad, as if it wants to cause suffering to the audience. And yet, he wasn't mad, just disappointed. At the jokes, the writing, the absolute lack of effort. The movie ended up getting Razzie nominations and lost to Jar Jar Binks. Schneider and Ebert eventually made peace. But the movie? Still just as bad. Roger Ebert didn't just dislike Freddy Got Fingered. He made it clear that it shouldn't exist. Not in 2001, not ever. Tom Green's attempt at shock comedy doesn't just push boundaries, it bulldozes through them, leaving behind a movie that feels less like a film and more like a dare. He directs, co-writes, and stars as Gord, an aspiring cartoonist with no direction, unless you count screaming, flailing, and dragging his poor father, Rip Torn, into one uncomfortable set piece after another. The premise? A false abuse allegation played for laughs. The execution? Less a comedy, more an endurance test. Ebert's review didn't hold back. This movie doesn't scrape the bottom of the barrel. This movie isn't the bottom of the barrel. This movie isn't below the bottom of the barrel. This movie doesn't deserve to be mentioned in the same sentence with barrels. The film flopped. Critics piled on, and yet, over time, Freddy Got Fingered found a strange afterlife. Some call it a subversive anti-comedy, others still see it as a cinematic fever dream best left forgotten. For Ebert, though, no debate, no reconsideration, just a 0-star review, and a movie that landed on his most hated list. Few films have been as infamous, as reviled, or as unwatchable as Caligula. Even in a decade known for pushing boundaries, this was something else, something that made even the most shocking films of the era feel tame. Roger Ebert didn't just dislike Caligula, he walked out. This wasn't a historical epic, it wasn't even an erotic drama. It was something else entirely, a twisted fever dream of excess filled with graphic violence, unsimulated sex, and a complete lack of anything resembling storytelling. Sickening, utterly worthless, shameful trash. That's how Ebert described it. On paper, the cast suggested prestige. Malcolm McDowell, Peter O'Toole, Helen Mirren, serious actors, somehow trapped in a movie that barely resembled one. The behind-the-scenes battles between screenwriter Gore Vidal, director Tinto Brass, and producer Bob Guccione turned Caligula into a chaotic mess, with Penthouse-funded reshoots splicing hardcore pornography into what was already an unhinged production. Ebert knew people would ignore his warning, that curiosity would win, that some would watch it anyway. And if his review wasn't enough, there was always one fellow moviegoer's reaction, a man who stood up, turned to the audience, and loudly declared, "This is the worst piece of shot I have ever seen." Sometimes, there's just nothing more to say. And there you have it. 10 films that left critics, audiences, and even their own creators wondering why. Some were misguided, some were chaotic disasters, and some, they never stood a chance. But that's the thing about bad movies. Sometimes they're just as fascinating as the great ones. They stick with you not for what they achieved, but for how spectacularly they collapsed. If you love deep dives into cinema, the forgotten, the underrated, the absolute train wrecks, you're in the right place. Subscribe to Vintage Verse for more films worth rediscovering and others worth avoiding at all costs. Until next time, choose wisely.